The 1973 Paris Peace Accords, ending a tragic American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. The 1973 Paris Peace Accords ended a tragically brutal conflict between North and South Vietnam, where the United States had given aid for over 20 years. The main negotiations were for the release of the American POWs and the American troops' withdrawal from the war. This led to Operation Homecoming and the end of the United States' involvement in the war against communism in Vietnam. But tragically, 2 years later, South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam. And even though the US was on bad terms with Vietnam by the end of the war, in 1995, we triumphantly made diplomatic relations with them. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century. During World War II, Vietnam came under Japanese control. After Japan's defeat in World War II, France reclaimed Vietnam. Political leader Ho Chi Minh formed Viet Minh, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam. His forces rose up triumphantly, taking over the northern city of Hanoi. The French attempted to maintain control but ended up losing at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In July 1954, the Geneva Agreements were signed. As part of the agreement, the French agreed to withdraw their troops from northern Vietnam. Vietnam would also be temporarily divided. They had 2 years to elect a president and reunite. However, the two sides then went to war on November 1st, 1955, because of their disagreements of the government. America then joined on March 8, 1965, to give aid to South Vietnam. If South Vietnam lost, America was afraid that the domino effect would happen. If Vietnam became a communist country, other Southeast Asian countries might too. So the current U.S. President, Lyndon Johnson, with the support from the American public, sent out combat forces in March of 1965. By June, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam, but more were later sent out because of the struggling South Vietnamese army. Over the course of the war, out of the 2.7 million Americans who served, 2,500 were captured. Of those, the first to get captured by the North Vietnamese was Everett Alvarez. He was sent to one of the most well-known camps, the Hanoi Hilton. They used it during the Vietnam War for the captured prisoners. In the camps, the prisoners endured tragic conditions like hunger and harsh beatings. They experienced boredom, discomfort, and torture over the period of their captivity.
Continued straight down. I ejected and broke my leg and both arms.
Until 1969 and 1970, they kept the POWs as isolated as possible. They accomplished this by maintaining mini camps scattered throughout northern Vietnam. Some of them only held 10 or 15 prisoners. Communication of any kind was forbidden, and those who didn't follow that rule would be severely punished. The Vietnamese wanted every prisoner to feel abandoned and alone. If a POW felt alone, it was easier for his integrators to convince him to give in to their demands for the propaganda material. Many prisoners went months, even years, without face-to-face communication with another American. POWs had to find a way to communicate. One of them was using Morse code. America had been unaware of this harsh treatment until 1966, when American POW Jeremiah Denton Jr. was being interviewed on TV. He blinked in Morse code the word torture, confirming any suspicions that the POWs were being mistreated.
But whatever the position of my government is, I support it fully. Whatever the position of my government is, I believe in it. Yes, sir. I am a member of that.
Many believe the North Vietnamese did not follow the rules of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are international treaties that contain important rules limiting the barbarity of war. They protect people who do not take part in fighting, like medics, civilians, aid workers, and those who can no longer fight, like the wounded, sick, and prisoners of war. The rules only apply in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or no longer taking part in the hostilities. But North Vietnam saw the American POWs as pirates instead of prisoners because America had bombed them and never officially declared war. In 1969, there was a Vietnamese Communist Party document made that quoted saying, "We do not view American pilots as prisoners of war, and we are not bound by the terms of the 1949 Geneva Convention governing the treatment of prisoners of war. We should apply the points of the Geneva Convention that are consistent with our humanitarian policies." Some of those rules were that they would provide the necessary food, clothing, and medicine needed. Where the prisoners are kept must be clean and airy, and that they can send one letter a month. People still debate over whether or not they followed these rules. In America in 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidential election. Many people had voted for him because they wanted America's involvement in the war to end. In the spring of 1969, as protests against the war escalated in the United States, U.S. troops in the war-torn country reached its highest number of nearly 550,000 men. Richard Nixon had started U.S. troop withdrawal, but he intensified bombing. Finally, in January of 1973, after 4 years of negotiations, representatives of North and South Vietnam, the United States, and the Viet Cong signed a peace agreement in Paris, ending a direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. It was called the Paris Peace Accords, or Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam. The document began with a statement that said, "The United States and all other countries respect the independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 agreements on Vietnam. They decide themselves the political future of South Vietnam through free and democratic general elections through international supervision." Henry Kissinger had played a major role during the Paris Peace Accords. He initialed a ceasefire agreement that provided for the withdrawal of the U.S. troops and Allied forces within 60 days. It also was for the return of the prisoners of war, a ban on introducing further military personnel into South Vietnam, and the withdrawal of foreign troops from Laos and Cambodia. Nixon had agreed to this. He would withdraw all American troops, and North Vietnam would return almost 600 prisoners of war. It was called Operation Homecoming. Operation Homecoming was a triumph in a tragic conflict. The Paris Peace Accords effectively removed the U.S. from the war in Vietnam. There were no longer any American combat forces in the war, and the North Vietnamese gave up their American POWs. Starting on February 12th and ending on April 4th, the North Vietnamese released 591 prisoners of war. Among their ranks are a number of now notable Americans, including Floyd Thompson, Everett Alvarez, John McCain, James Stockdale, Pete Peterson, and Jeremiah Denton Jr. The reactions to Operation Homecoming to the American public were mixed. They got the prisoners of war back, but the war was also very expensive. The United States spent about $168 billion, and a lot of the veterans from the war were treated poorly because they returned when South Vietnam was losing. There was also the POW MIA issue. The U.S. listed about 2,500 Americans as prisoners of war or missing in action, but only 1,200 Americans were reported to have been killed in action with no body recovered. Many of these were airmen who were shot down over North Vietnam or Laos. Investigations of these incidents have involved figuring out whether the men involved survived while being shot down. POW MIA activists played a role in pushing the U.S. government to improve its efforts in resolving the fates of these missing soldiers. In 1995, America got the chance to make amends with Vietnam. President Bill Clinton announced that there was diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam. It started in 1994 when Clinton lifted the trade embargo on Vietnam. Then, in July of 1995, while making the decision of the relations, Republican Senator John McCain advised him that it was time to normalize relations with Vietnam. Once that happened, the United States opened a consulate in Saigon, while Vietnam opened one in San Francisco. So even though the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War for 20 years, instead of being enemies, Vietnam and the U.S. have made an unlikely friendship. This was all because of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords and how it helped end the war quicker, end America's involvement in the war, and eventually make relations between the two countries.